I've spent so much time in the actual trial, and I always hear them say the burden of proof is on the prosecution or the plaintiff. It's a civil case. I found that to not be the case. I know that that's true legally. I know that's true constitutionally, but in practice, I always found that the jury believes that if we're not down here for what the prosecution is saying, you need to give me an alternative explanation for why we are here, because they're savvy enough to know there were 1,000 ways this case could have been disposed of before we got down here. And when they see the prosecution over there and they know the court reporter by first name and they say, hey, Doris, hey, John, they're familiar with the judge, they know the bailiffs. You got all of this mahogany wood and the seal is up there and the flags, and they seem like they're part of everything, and the defendant is a one-down interloper. And it just seems like the entire system is stacked against the defendant, and prosecutors just don't tend to bring cases they don't think they can win.
Yeah, and you're right about the relationship. I remember in Louisiana where I clerked on the Fifth Circuit, one of the judges in a trial asked the defense, is the defense ready to present your case? And then turned to the prosecutors and said, are we ready to present our case? And so that relationship can get a little too close. I tell my students, this is an important principle of American law, the presumption of innocence, but don't you believe it when you go into that courtroom. The burden is on you. They believe your client is there for a reason. And so you've got to give them a clear narrative as to what really happened in this case. And you can do that. I think jurors are basically very fair people. I've always been impressed with juries.
I'm like you. I'm a fan of the jury system. I think they do get it right most of the time. It's been said that the collective IQ of the jury is at least 1,200, and that's pretty damn impressive. And they get it right, but they get it right based on what's put in front of them, right? You see people go insane, like on the O.J. Simpson case, for example, or whatever. But the court of public opinion has a whole different set of data than those in the jury have. And the public thinks that they go back there and say guilty or innocent. That's not the case, is it? They have a whole set of jury instructions, questions that may be 6 or 7 elements that you have to answer. And if you answer those yes, then you go to page 19. If you answer no, you go to page 11. It's just not as simple as the court of public opinion. And they hear things that aren't admissible to the jury. And so the jury, I think, gets it right. But the caveat to that is based on what they hear.
Jurors are incredibly conscientious. The problem is that it's a sort of garbage in, garbage out. If the judges blow it, then you're going to get a bad decision, because often the jurors do find it frustrating. Sometimes they'll ask for information, the judge will decline to give it to them. And sometimes the instructions are wrong. But the atmosphere inside the courtroom is very different from the atmosphere outside. The reason the subtitle of my book is Free Speech in an Age of Rage. Rage is all around us. And as I discuss in the book, rage is an odd thing. It's addictive, it's contagious. But the one thing that people won't admit is that they like it. It allows you to do things and say things you wouldn't ordinarily do or say. And both parties have this rage addiction.
Right.
And, the fact is, it's during periods of rage that we lose civil liberties. That is the most dangerous period for free speech, is that in each of the periods, my book talks about the periods and personalities that helped influence our understanding of free speech. But we're not as good as our advertising. We have arrested people by the thousands, communists, socialists, unionists, feminists. It occurs when we're really angry or we're really afraid. And we then turn on our neighbors. We turn on free speech.
It's interesting that you said addiction, because there is considerable evidence that the same parts of the brain light up when people get into rage, particularly if they think that they're getting revenge in some way. The same parts of the brain light up when people are addicted to heroin or opioids and they're getting a fix from that. The pleasure centers in the brain are seen to light up when people are in this rage and revenge against someone, either real or perceived, that they've been aggrieved by, and they think they're getting their pound of flesh, and they go into this rage mode. It lights up just the same as if they're addicted to drugs, the same pathways, the same pleasure centers. And that is a scary thing when you get into that addictive loop.
It is. One of the things I talk about in the book is the premise of the book is that free speech is a human right. It's a natural right. It's not a right that's bestowed by the government. It's a right that belongs to us as human beings. It's a right that we need to be fully human. And much of that research is the same research you just cited, Dr. Phil, which is what we have found is that if you're denied the ability to speak, to express yourself, to project part of yourself in the world around you, parts of the human brain actually change. The hippocampus actually shrinks. We've studied inmates in segregation, explorers cut off. We physically change when we're unable to speak freely. And what the book suggests is that we need to understand free speech, but it requires us to understand what humans are, what to be human is, and why free speech is essential to being fully human. And unfortunately, part of that is rage, because rage is the farthest spectrum point from reason, right? They're on the same spectrum. And it's when reason breaks down. But rage is a weird thing, right? Because if you agree with it, it's righteous. And if you don't, it's dangerous. And the biggest danger to free speech is that when we have rage rhetoric like we do today, the government uses it for what I call state rage. They use it to try to regulate the speech of all citizens. And that's each of these periods, the government has seen that opportunity and has reduced all of our free speech.
You say in your book, this country was founded in an age of rage. You talk about different things like the Boston Tea Party and January 6th. I interpreted it this way. It turns into violence when people run out of socially acceptable ways to express themselves. They run out of words, they run out of coping, and that's when they resort to violence. Either their speech has been cut off, they're not allowed to do it, or they just run out of ways to express themselves. That's when they turn to violence. And I think we're starting to see some of that now. I don't know whether it's because they feel that their free speech is being suppressed or they're just running out of word power and are frustrated and turning to violence. But we're starting to see violence on the uptick now, and that's concerning. Homeowners, when's the last time you checked on your home title? If your answer is never, then this is for you. Scammers are stealing titles and your equity is the target. Criminals forge your signature and just like that, your home title can be transferred out of your name. That's why I partnered with Home Title Lock, so you can find out today if you're already a victim. Use my promo code Phil at HometitleLock.com and you'll get a free title history report. Plus, you'll get a free trial of their $1 million triple lock protection. That's 24/7 monitoring of your title. Urgent alerts to any changes, and if fraud does happen, they'll spend up to $1 million to fix it. That's HometitleLock.com, promo code Phil. I'm curious what you think about the death of critical thinking.
I think it does go to your earlier point that this is an addiction and people like it. They just don't want to admit to it, but they like it. It gives you that freedom to do things that you would normally condemn. But the lack of critical thinking is a very important point. The book has a section on higher education. And that's part of the issue there. I just got back from Berlin speaking at the World Forum. I was one of only 2 people from the free speech community. So it was a very lonely place. It was probably the largest collection of anti-free speech figures I've ever been a part of. Right. And But free speech isn't a free fall in Europe. The EU is demonstrably anti-free speech, and they're getting even more aggressive. Our anti-free speech movement really began in higher education and then metastasized throughout our country. And what I regret the most is not just the loss of diversity of thought at universities, but what the students have lost. We've turned them into these emotional basket cases. We've told them that they should not be triggered. They shouldn't have to see ideas that they find disturbing. And it's a shame because when I went to University of Chicago, I loved it. It was like walking into the bar scene in Star Wars. I lived in a vegetarian cooperative, and downstairs we had the Trotskyites called the Spartacus League that would meet in the basement. Upstairs I had militant vegans, and next door I had absolutely insane libertarians. And I loved it all. I loved it because all these students were seeing what I was seeing and seeing something very different. And it was an awakening for me. And that's missing today. Most students are on campuses that run from the left to the far left. They rarely will be taught by someone who's conservative, libertarian, even dissenting. And that's a shame because you lose that critical thinking element because you're not exposed to opposing views.
And I was in school in the late 70s, and we actually had really dissenting viewpoints that would come, and everyone went to hear what they had to say, so you knew how to combat that. You knew what their arguing points were. You went to be empowered by their thinking, and sometimes you got captured by it, but you went to hear it. Now you've got the heckler's veto, where you boo them off a stage or you keep them from even coming. And I don't understand. It seems like you learn by proving yourself wrong. And now there's not even a chance of that happening, which is just intellectual rot. I don't get how we've allowed this to happen, but we have. It seems like we're circling the drain intellectually, particularly in our elite universities. It really bothers me. What does that say for where the country is headed?
That's a good question because, quite frankly, as I say in the book, the hardest silo that we will have to tackle is higher education. There's no indication that faculty are willing to change anything. And frankly, all of these Harvard faculty that are objecting that their free speech is under attack, I've criticized the Trump administration for aspects of its policies, but I wrote a column to the Harvard faculty that maybe you should just sit this one out and leave it to the free speech community, because you're the last group of people we want on our side. You have spent decades denying free speech and intellectual diversity to anyone, center or right. So you have zero credibility coming into this fight. That doesn't mean we don't fight for that. But the book actually talks about ways to reform higher education, including the withholding of funds. Too often these universities treat taxpayers like their captive audience. And they aggressively, purge their faculty of any dissenting views that probably represents the majority of taxpayers. And then they say, how dare you think about reducing our funding? Well, you can lose funding. And also donors are very important. One of the reasons Harvard and Columbia changed was that donors finally had enough and said, no. And I think they were shocked at Harvard. They were certainly shocked at Columbia. So donors can make a difference by saying, look, if you don't have intellectual diversity on your faculty, I'm not going to sit here and hear how concerned you are and how you wish you had greater diversity. I just will withhold my money until you have diversity on campus. I don't consider myself a naive person, but I would never have imagined that education could become what it is today. The level of fear, intimidation, orthodoxy. My blog, I often have faculty that write and say, look, this is happening at my university. And I say, why don't you write about it? And they'll say, I can't. And people don't understand that this cancel culture takes everything you value as an intellectual. Most of us only wanted to be professors. That's the only thing we really ever wanted to be.
In talking about free speech, there's a description here. It says, the history of the struggle of free speech is the story of extraordinary people, nonconformists who refuse to yield to abusive authority. And here is a mosaic of vivid characters and controversies. This is talking about your book. When I read that, I came away thinking, maybe that was true at one point. But now with the web and bots and keyboard bullies, cowards who can publish lies with anonymity, it's not just authority. It seems like we now have the tail wagging the dog. Is there a point at which you see people that are crossing the line? Obviously, defamatory speech is not protected. Is it the same as it was before the age of the internet?
Well, that's a pretty profound question. And to start where you began, the discussion of these extraordinary people in the book are really our true heroes. Our true heroes are not people like John Adams, who became a huge hypocrite and used the laws to try to execute his opponents, became everything he fought against. Our true heroes are all the people we arrested. They are, George Bernard Shaw once said that unreasonable people are people who expect history to conform to them. And then he added, that's why all history is made by unreasonable people. And these are glorious, unreasonable people that we should know about and we should try to be like. They were people who just refused to shut up. And that takes a lot of courage. But your second part of your question, I think, is really profound, and that is, how does the internet change this? I talk about the internet in the book because it is the most important invention of free speech since the printing press, and in many ways is more important. It created for an important period a truly unfettered forum for people to speak in. That's one of the reasons why governments and others have worked so hard to control the internet. That's why the EU is threatening Musk with $1 billion fine unless he starts to censor people again, because they need control over the ability of people to speak. Now that comes, however, with that magnification of the public forum comes a magnification of the dangers. That it means that falsehoods can travel even faster around the world. It means that harm can be magnified. Now, I am a dinosaur. I truly believe that the solution to bad speech is good speech. But the one thing I know for certain, I say this in The Indispensable Right, is the one thing history has shown us is that censorship has a perfect failure rate. And throughout our history, censorship has not worked once. It has not stopped a single idea, stopped a single movement. It has a total failure rate. And the reason is because free speech is like water. It finds its way out. Now, the last part of your question, Dr. Phil, was, how does this change? The funny thing about when I go in the book is that many of the terms we use today were used at the beginning of the Republic. And there were defamation actions that could be brought. People refer to me as a free speech absolutist. That's not true. You can regulate speech. You could regulate criminal speech. Like child pornography. You can certainly sue people for defamation. I actually believe that we should consider increasing defamation. The Supreme Court originally in New York Times versus Sullivan said that public officials were subject to a more difficult standard. If someone lied about them, they had to prove something more, what's called the actual malice standard. But then they extended it to public figures like yourself. And they said, well, you're actually more powerful than most politicians. The Supreme Court said, frankly, people could care less about most politicians. They do care about what Dr. Phil says. So you're under the same standard. I think they went a bridge too far on that one. I don't understand why a celebrity or high-profile figure should be more susceptible to defamation. It's whether you're a football star or a television personality, the fact that you're successful in what you do doesn't mean that your reputation should be fair game for anyone on the internet.
It's not even people on the internet. I've got people that may attack an idea that I put out on the internet, and when my cybersecurity people drill down on it, most of the attack is coming from bot farms that are housed in Russia. There are a small number of people that are attacking those who say things they don't like. At the beginning of the pandemic, I made the comment that a prolonged quarantine of our shutting down of our schools and our children could and would create more damage to our young people than the virus ever would. I said just taking them out of school, we were at the highest level of depression, anxiety, and loneliness since records had been kept, and that taking that support system away and removing the eyes of mandated reporters on children that were being molested and abused would take away protections that were necessary, that social arresting of their development and educational gaps, all of these things would create problems that we would be forever trying to close those gaps, and it would create more problems than the virus ever would. It would create more death than the virus ever would. I was attacked unmercifully, and I didn't back off of it a bit. I doubled down, said it was right, and of course it was right. And I wasn't sitting on the curb waiting, but of course nobody came by and said, "Oh, gee, you were right about that." I was not out on the curb waiting for them to drive by and say, "Hey, sorry." Most of that, some of it was driven by legacy media. A lot of it were bot farms. And it seems like you have to protect free speech. And I couldn't agree more, even with those who attack those in the public eye. But it does seem with the internet that it has been amplified and elevated to a dangerous degree.
It does. And what you're describing, of course, is that you are a wonderfully unreasonable person. And that's exactly what George Bernard Shaw was talking about. It takes a lot of courage to do that, to do what you did. And, I spoke at the University of Chicago a year or so ago, and in the front row were all the people that signed the Great Barrington Declaration, or a lot of them. And after my speech, I went up to these scientists who have been vindicated on what they said in that letter. How many of you have been rehired? How many of you have been brought back into your associations? How many of you have received any apology from your departments? Not one. Most of them weren't rehired. So these are people that prevail. They showed that what they were saying could have avoided huge costs to society. They're still persona non gratas because they broke from the mob. And you're right about the internet in terms of how it can magnify that. Now, we can take steps to try to deal with bots, finding ways to make it more difficult for bots to apply. But there are other people that, as you noted, anonymity brings out the very worst in us. These dormant genes that come out when we're very angry or very afraid. I've also been subject to swatting. I've had threats, death threats for years. I have one of the longest standing cancel campaigns. People were trying to get me fired since the Clinton impeachment, which goes back some.
Oh, I know you have, yeah.
And they threaten you. They threaten my family. They even threatened my dog Luna. And Luna's a golden doodle. Who threatens a golden doodle? I mean, really? I can understand a Shih Tzu perhaps, but a golden doodle? I mean, it just, when I read that, I was like, oh man, you really need to get a hold of yourself, because nobody threatens a golden doodle.
That's outrageous. I mean, we need to draw a line somewhere. And you acknowledge that even though rage rhetoric can lead to crime and riotous actions, but that's an important distinction in your eyes. When it changes to behavior, okay, now you can take action, but people thinking about it, talking about it, that's a different thing, and we need to protect that in America. That's an important distinction versus taking over a building, blocking someone from class, intimidation in terms of surrounding a student, not allowing them to move, things that are actions. That's different than speech. And that's where you think the line needs to be drawn.
I think we would eliminate much of the problem that we saw in the last year by focusing on conduct and creating that bright line. And it also means, though, making tough choices. I had a university president call me a few weeks ago saying, I read your book. What can I do to improve free speech on my campus? And I said, one thing you could do is, why don't you sign the Chicago letter? And this is a letter put out by the late Robert Zimmer, the president of Chicago. It's a beautiful letter. And he sent it out to recently admitted students. And these students were excited to receive the letter. It's like only 5% get in. And so they open up this letter and he says, look, Congratulations. But some of you are probably worried that you're going to come here and you're going to face triggering ideas and things that make you uncomfortable, and there won't be a safe space here. And I want to assure you that there are no safe spaces at the University of Chicago. We will do nothing to protect you from ideas. And so if you want safe spaces, you should go elsewhere. It was a brilliant letter. And I told this president, why don't you adopt that letter? And there was this long pause and he said, I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. Can you suggest something I could do and still keep my job? and it was an honest moment. And I said, okay, that's a tougher one. But what you have to first start out is to make clear to students that you shout down a speaker on my campus, you deplatform someone on my campus by going into a classroom or an event, and you're gone. You're expelled. And that would go a long way.